PR Military Analytics. The greatest mass migrations, protests and riots are caused by critical phenomena such as war, natural disasters, and emergencies. Because of the war in Ukraine, there was one of the biggest mass revolts in the Russian army that we have ever seen. While Russian President Vladimir Putin or other officials did not openly admit that they were facing a manpower shortage, the longtime Russian president ordered last month to add 137,000 soldiers to his army, bringing the total number up to 1.15 million. In addition, with the latest additions, 147,000 Russian soldiers were sent to the Ukrainian fronts in the past 3 months. We see that this is actually just the beginning, and that Putin will push the second partial mobilization further. This situation causes hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers to revolt. Putin hasn't mentioned this big problem of operation at this time, although Vladimir Putin tried to hide this. It is reported that hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Russian army have started mass uprisings, especially in recent days, and fled from the front lines, trenches, and barracks in Ukraine. Russian soldiers refused to sign contracts with the Russian army, despite promises of high cash payments, social packages, and possible accommodation. In addition, it was reported by the Ukrainian General Staff that approximately 3,000 Russian soldiers applied and took action to surrender to the Ukrainian army in March and reduce the number of escapes within the Russian army. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov recently reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin will guarantee long holidays and job security to Russians who volunteer to fight in Ukraine. The Russian leader reportedly promised to make these changes after an employee of the regional department of the Ministry of Emergencies approached him during his trip to Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, Peskov said. But despite all this, Russian soldiers refused to participate in the war in Ukraine. In fact, Russian soldiers are quite right about this, because Russian troops in Ukraine suffer from equipment shortages, housing problems, and even basic food problems. Therefore, desertion actions are constantly taking place within the Russian army. For this reason, Moscow authorities resort to unimaginable ways to close this gap in the Russian army. Ukrainian authorities reported that Russia began to take sick and wounded soldiers from hospitals to compensate for their losses. Russia is recruiting volunteers from a mental health unit in St. Petersburg for Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine, offering cash incentives and more to encourage people to fight. On the homepage of the website of the Psychoneurological Dispensary No. 2 in St. Petersburg, there was a poster calling for conscription for the volunteer battalions of Kronstadt, Narva, and Pavlovsk. According to the ad, which was later removed, volunteers who signed a contract of at least 6 months are promised lump sum payments, compensation for housing and social services, and the right to receive veteran status. That's how bad the general situation in the Russian army is. It's also known that the Russian army has extremely post-soldier discipline and turbo-field vehicle training. This, in turn, lowers morale and increases the potential for disease. There is another very striking reason that increases these great escapes within the Russian army and causes the citizens of Russia to flee their country. That is the decision of the leader Vladimir Putin to facilitate conscription. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a new law facilitating mobilization in the Russian army. According to the law, reservists and recruits can now be called to duty by electronic notification. The law, which was approved in the parliament within 2 days, was also signed by Putin recently. Until now, summons had to be hand-delivered. Under the new law, reservists can be summoned electronically through a Russian public service portal or by placing the order to a third party. As we mentioned, Putin decided in September last year to mobilize 300,000 reservists. After this decision, a Russian influx started abroad and thousands of people left the country. The Kremlin says no second wave of mobilization is currently planned, but the Russians are worried about a new mobilization decision as the Ukrainian army prepares for a major counteroffensive. The new law reportedly reinforces these fears. According to the new law, summons issued by local military branches will continue to be sent by mail, but will be considered valid as soon as they are uploaded electronically to Russia's government portal. Summoners who do not apply to the military service will be banned from leaving Russia. Their licenses will be confiscated and they'll be barred from obtaining loans or selling their homes and other assets. Russian police will have the right to catch deserters who are facing jail time, tax offices, universities, and other public institutions. Christians will be obliged to provide personal information of conscripts. These measures will also apply to Russians fleeing the country or working remotely. Observers say the new law provides a mechanism to quickly strengthen the ranks in preparation for the next Ukrainian counterattack. Abbas Ghaliamov, Putin's former copywriter who left the country, says the law could fuel discontent. On the one hand, there is a growing unwillingness and discontent to fight. On the other hand, there is a fear of increasing repression. People are forced to choose between going to war and dying or going to jail. But there are millions of Russians who are left with such an option, and these people no longer want to live in fear of war in their country. Yes, it has been reported that nearly 400,000 Russian citizens have prepared to leave the country so far, and even almost half of this number has already left the country. Giving specific reasons. Currently, the Russians are fed up with mobilization and similar decisions. Although Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin officials stated that this decision is different from mobilization, Russian citizens no longer trust almost any political official in Moscow. At the top of this list of distrust is, of course, leader Vladimir Putin. One of the biggest reasons why Russian leader Putin hasn't been trusted by his citizens in such a short time is actually his decisions regarding military service. In other words, decisions such as the previous mobilization decision taken by Putin and the new law facilitating conscription, which he has now approved, alienated his people from him because this new law adopted by the Russian leader will deeply affect the residents of Crimea, both in Russia and in the Black Sea. The Kremlin-controlled administration of Russian-occupied Crimea announced that they are planning to recruit 2,500 young men into the Russian army as part of this latest recruitment campaign. However, the so-called administration of Sevastopol announced that it plans to recruit 500 people into the Russian army as part of the conscription campaign. In addition, human rights experts stated that the indigenous people of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars, are the ethnic group that's being conscripted the most. Alexei Tiniko, chairman of the board of the Crim SOS human rights organization, stressed that the Crimean Tatars are continued to be subjected to pressure from the Russian administration. Tiniko stated that during the forced mobilization in the autumn of 2022, 90% of the conscription calls were given to the Crimean Tatars in some settlements. It's observed that there has been no change in the Kremlin's Crimean policy with the new conscription law. Again, the majority of those conscripted into the peninsula by electronic methods became Crimean Tatars. So far, more than 35,000 Crimean youth have been exposed to the activities of the Kremlin administration, which has forced them to conscription in the Russian army. With the new current conscription law, a total of more than 5,000 Crimean Tatars will be forced to join the Russian army again. These figures will only apply to Crimea, but the residents of the peninsula also believe that these numbers will increase. Many residents of Crimea think that the Russian authorities have given too low numbers for conscription so as not to intimidate the people because the escape from Crimea continues at full speed. On the one hand, there is a growing unwillingness and discontent to fight. On the other, there is the fear of increasing repression. People are forced to choose between going to war and dying or going to jail. But there are millions of Russians who are left with such an option, and these people no longer want to live in fear of the war in their country. The war between Ukraine and Russia has affected these two countries as well as the whole of Europe and even the whole world, economically, militarily, and politically. Almost all the states of the world turned against Russia. Countries in the geography with Russia especially increased their defense expenditures and started to allocate funds for the Ukrainian army. Ukraine, on the other hand, continues to drive the Russians out of its country. Knowing that almost the whole world is behind it, and as if to thank its army for the modern weapons donated, the clashes between the two countries are concentrated in eastern and southern Ukraine. Conflicts in the east have intensified in and around Bakhmut in recent months. The defense structures of the Russian troops stationed here were on the verge of collapse with the successful HIMARS attacks of the Ukrainian artillery. The Russian troops there have mostly fled to the hilly parts of Bakhmut, and their fire on the Ukrainian troops is hardly effective. The Ukrainian army, which also blocked the supply routes of the Russian troops stationed in the east, officially left the Russians hungry, thirsty, and unarmed. Winter is still not over in Ukraine, and the Russian soldiers are struggling with the harsh winter. On the one hand, trying to keep their psychology intact on the one hand, and trying not to be cannon fodder for the Ukrainian artillery on the southern front. The Ukrainian army has completely taken over the city of Kherson. The few Russian attacks from the left bank of the Dnipro are successfully thwarted. The attacks of the Ukrainian air forces, especially from Kherson to the Crimean side, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet stationed in Sevastopol, continue without slowing down. The Ukrainian Air Force has reduced the Russian presence in the Black Sea to 7 ships. Russian air defense systems deployed over Crimea are also systematically hit. Earlier this week, experts warned the Russian military that Ukraine could launch a possible airborne operation on the left bank of the Dnipro if this attack takes place. As experts claim, the Ukrainian army will move a little closer to its ultimate target, the Crimea. Apart from these desertions continue within the Russian army. Some of the 300,000 Russian youth recruited by the partial mobilization decision announced in the autumn were sent to Ukraine. But almost every day, 300 to 500 mobilized soldiers are eliminated by the Ukrainian army as the commanders keep the mobilized soldiers on the front line. The vast majority of those who remain either lay down their weapons and surrender to the Ukrainian army or flee from the front. So what did Ukraine do for deserters in the Russian army? Today, we will give you information and details about the answer to this question. The Ukrainian government has signed a project that will go down in history after the partial mobilization decision of Russian President Vladimir Putin. I Want to Live was launched as a Ukrainian state project designed to help Russian military personnel surrender safely. The aim is to ensure that the Russian soldiers fleeing their units are safely removed from the Ukrainian borders and reunited with their families. At this point, it is seen that the I Want to Live project has been carried on with success. A total of 9,836 people from the temporarily occupied regions of Russia and Ukraine applied to the I Want to Live project for the Russians who are ready to surrender during the 6 months of the project. More than 14 million people, 84% of whom were users, visited that I Want to Live website. Despite regular attempts by the Russian Federal Service for Communications, Information Technology and Mass Media Supervision to block access to the project, relatives and loved ones of the soldiers other than Russian soldiers applied to the phone line. Most of the time mobilized, Russians do not have access to the internet or mobile communication when they arrive in Ukraine, so their families use the I Want to Live line instead. So how well did the I Want to Live project work set up? 6 days before Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the mobilization of 300,000 reservists, that I Want to Live hotline received 6,543 calls from Russian personnel in 1 week. It was stated that those contacted through the service were verified as Russian soldiers using personal data and service number. The call center, which is managed by 10 operators, is said to have been relocated to a secret location to avoid Moscow interference during a busy call flow. Fears that Putin will announce a second mobilization for his special military operation still remain. The 24/7 hotline receives between 50 and 100 calls per day, and messages are also sent to the service's Telegram channel. The call center was moved from the division's Kiev offices to a secret location a month ago for fear of being the target of Russian attacks. Officials of the project declined to comment on the number of deliveries completed, but described the service as a complete success. In the first stage, the mobilized, partially mobilized, and not yet mobilized Russian soldiers should call this helpline and, "Today I am leaving," and surrender. After that, soldiers are obliged to leave their personal data. The soldier has to call back and say, "I will surrender," after reaching Ukrainian soil, and Ukrainian operators are helping the surrendered soldiers reach a safe place where they will encounter Ukrainian special forces. A few months ago, it was reported that there were soldiers begging to get out of the mess in Kherson during the extensive Ukrainian counteroffensive. The call center received calls from the Russians, and the Russian soldiers said to them, "Save our souls because we got stuck in the mud. Our battalion fell completely. We have 10 soldiers left. Please get us out of this mess." One of the call center employees said the volume and content of calls gave him hope that Russia's resolve was weakening. Some people call and say, "I'm somewhere in the army. I want to surrender." Others say, "I'm afraid to mobilize in Russia. What should I do?" Others say, "I am on Ukrainian soil. I want to surrender." They are afraid and do not know what to do. So what happens to the Russian soldiers who surrender to the Ukrainians? Those who surrender are offered the opportunity to be part of a prisoner exchange for Ukrainian soldiers captured by the Russians as part of such exchanges. A total of 1646 Ukrainian personnel were reportedly released by the Russian government, with the most recent of which 50 were exchanged from both sides. It is not standard policy to report the number of Russian soldiers returned in prisoner exchanges, but the freed Russian prisoners were given the personal want to live business cards, but also had the option that if they were redeployed to the battlefield, which is not uncommon, they could surrender again by telling the operator the number on the card. Many of the Russian soldiers currently in Ukraine are uneducated and unarmed Russian youth who were recruited by the partial mobilization decision announced in the autumn. As such, the I Want to Live line established by Ukraine saves the lives of many young people and strives to bring them back to real life. So what other projects does the Ukrainian government produce for Russian soldiers who want to surrender? Tens of thousands of drones have been deployed across Ukraine to destroy Russian elements, spy on their formations, and direct bombs at their targets. But last month, the Ukrainian military launched a program to use UAVs in a more unconventional role, guiding Russian soldiers who want to surrender. The basis of the program is that in late November, the Ukrainian army tensely followed a path marked by a drone where a Russian soldier threw his gun to the ground, raised his hands, and delivered it to the 54th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army. A few weeks later, the Ukrainian General Staff released a training video explaining how Russian soldiers could surrender to a Ukrainian drone. And this is now part of Ukraine's far-reaching effort to persuade Russian soldiers to give up. It is too early to know whether the drone effort will attract meaningful numbers of Russian deserters. But this adds another way for Ukraine to recruit Russian deserters, adding a distinctly modern twist to the age-old information warfare tactic, and could at least erode Russian morale on the battlefield. Russia's defeats have already provided an opportunity for Ukraine to exploit this low morale, especially after the Kremlin sent thousands of new troops into fierce battles with little training and insufficient supplies in the fall. The fact that so many desertions from the Russian army are the biggest proof that there are great problems in the army and that the mobilized soldiers are not comfortable in the army. Isn't it delusional to hope that the Russian army will gain any war in such an environment? It is difficult to predict what the coming days will show us about the Ukraine war, but it seems that the Russian army will not be able to continue this war any longer as long as it suffers such losses. There are a lot of updates from the Donetsk region here after suffering a series of defeats. Russians realized that Ukrainians already knew how Russians were going to attack them and started destroying the Russian assault units already on the approach. In order to solve the problem, Russian forces started sending several assault units in suicidal attacks to divert Ukrainian attention, and then sent a second group to hit the real target. Last time I told you that Russian forces launched unsuccessful tank assaults north of Virginia in an attempt to recapture an important strongpoint on a hill. I also told you that Ukrainians reinforced the units on the contact line with atoms, and Ukrainians started destroying Russian vehicles with supplies. The freshest reports indicate that Ukrainians have doubled down on their efforts to destroy Russian forces before they even reach the front. If previously we saw a lot of combat footage showing how Ukrainians destroyed Russian tanks and armored vehicles in front of Virginia, then over the last week, Ukrainians have successfully increased the range of effective fire and started targeting Russian armor in Pisky, which is around 4 kilometers away from the closest Ukrainian positions. Several days ago, Ukrainians filmed their preventative operation and showed how they successfully prevented a Russian assault near Virginia by destroying one armored fighting vehicle and forcing the other one to turn around and flee. A long series of defeats around Virginia seemed to have forced Russians to stop pushing in this direction, especially as they started having extreme problems with supplies due to the constant ATM fire. Instead, Russians diverted their attention to Novelsk. Attacking Novelsk is not easy either. Russians have to cross vast fields under artillery, mortar, and ATM fire. In previous isolated attacks, their tanks did not even reach the target. However, the supply lines of this group are quite safe, which is why the decision was made to increase the intensity of attacks in this direction. It seems like Russian forces learned from their mistakes, developed a new plan of attack, and tricked Ukrainian forces. Previously, Russians were always attacking along the ravine. Such a tactic had its advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, they successfully avoided crossfire because Ukrainians in Pervomaisk could not fire at them directly. On the other hand, it made it easier for the Ukrainians in Novelsk to destroy them because Novelsk is located on the highlands. In any case, the practice showed that the disadvantages outweighed the advantages because Russians were always destroyed on the approach. However, this time, in addition to sending one assault units into yet another suicidal attack, they suddenly opened a second line of attack from the south. Geolocated footage released by the Russian side showed that Russians used 2 tanks and several squads of infantry in their second line of attack. Each tank rapidly advanced along the tree line, suppressed Ukrainian fire, and paved the way for Russian infantry to engage. It looks like the first suicidal group drew the attention of all ADM crews that operate on the hill in Novelsk. And while the first group was being hunted down and destroyed, the second group exploited the window of opportunity and safely used their tanks to achieve their goal. In the northern part of the region, Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation. Ukrainian Marines from the 36th Brigade continued destroying Russian concentrations of forces along the embankment. Judging by the combat footage, most of them are hiding in the remnants of the destroyed bridge, although some of them are establishing additional firing points. Ukrainian fighters from the 110th Mechanized Brigade continue curtailing Russian attempts at advancing towards Stepovy. A lot of artillery strikes are conducted on their main bridgehead, which is in Krasnohorivka. Ukrainian president recently visited Avdiivka and awarded Ukrainian fighters for stopping the recent Russian offensive in the region. A lot of medals were received by soldiers from the 110th Mechanized Brigade who were responsible for the hottest section of the front line and took the hardest hits. The soldiers, in turn, gifted the president with the patch of their brigade.